great to be here and to have people in person. It really, virtual is all right, but there's nothing like all being in the room together. And I have to say, I'm very pleased that you all asked me to come here. It's so great to be in a town where people wear the right baseball cap. And I don't get any grief, as I do in New York sometimes, going through security for wearing mine. So I wanted to start with, let's set the stage, and we're here. You know, I'm old enough to remember when we had payers, we had providers, we had pharma, but these days it seems as though everyone works together. And Anne, I'm just wondering, where are the opportunities for a health system to pair with researchers and pair with people who are trying to develop gene therapies?
So thank you, and first of all, pleasure to be here. Thank you for being here. Brian, thank you for being here. And Scott, thank you as always for your incredible stewardship, leadership, everything you do for Mass General Brigham. I would just start by saying we are at a pivotal point right now in healthcare. I know we could have said this a number of times over the years, but so many things that have been going on really that came to light and life during the pandemic has made the kinds of things that you're talking about absolutely critical. We have to, as a society, we have to, as healthcare organizations, we have to, as everyone in this room, no matter what industry you're in, start to think collectively about what we can do for the future of healthcare, how we can work together. So you do single out gene and cell therapy for an excellent reason. That is the overall theme of this conference. But I'll just step back and say, healthcare is changing so rapidly in so many different ways. The continuum of healthcare, how healthcare is delivered, all the new things that are going on in startups everywhere. The very traditional model of healthcare as episodic acute care, not the continuum of health and healthcare that involve academic medical centers, that involve specialty hospitals, that involve community hospitals, that involve ambulatory centers, and fundamentally involve the home, tech-enabled care everywhere, particularly in the home. These are things that all of us need to collectively look at from a very different lens. So the previous approach to this, which I think we've all appreciated since we grew up in it, is now very, very different. And specifically to your point, when we think about gene and cell therapy, when we think about the promise, the future of that therapy, or I should say those therapeutics, which are starting in small areas, and you're going to be hearing about that all throughout this conference. But where that can go in terms of so many different diseases, that is really bringing together the research base, the academics, everything that we do in academic healthcare systems, working in partnership with clinicians. And that's what we do every day. That's our differentiator at Mass General Brigham. That is where you have to look at what we can do collectively, and everyone in this room needs to be part of it, no matter what industry they represent.
Speaking of industries wanting to be part of it, Brian, I wonder what intrigued you about becoming part of the World Medical Information Forum?
Well, number one, you can't think of a better partner than Mass General in terms of the number one research platform in the world in terms of medical. That's number one. But frankly, as an employer, you kind of went across all the things. We have 200,000 employees, but there's 600,000 family members that we are responsible for their health care. We're self-insured. It's a $2 billion a year investment we make. And then secondly, if you think about what the pandemic taught us, was the way we had to actually do that completely different. With the emerging sciences coming at you, what they meant, working with 5 medical experts that we had hired to work with us full time to help us figure out how to handle all this. So that was an eye-opening, not only in the difficulties of a pandemic, but frankly in the availability of the science to actually apply with a pace. I mean, Anne's done this her whole life, but for an amateur from the outside, it was that was the incredible part of it, is the pace at which it got applied. And then we look at it in terms of, obviously the business dynamics of these new companies need to be supported and delivered much earlier in their stream than they would have been. And there's much more interest in doing that. And that's a two-way street. So a lot of people want to put money in earlier than probably would have done decades ago, or a decade ago even. But on the other hand, that creates confusion, sorting that out. And then also the acquisition side of it, of the eco-structure. And then I come out as a citizen, in the communities I represent, and here in Boston, my home, which is, how do we help this go along? We can go at it in a theoretical sense of advocacy for research dollars, for the great places like Mass General, but we could also go, we need housing. We need other types of, everything's the great docs and scientists in this room, but you need the people to support them. And so thinking about how the community is built to support these wonderful infrastructures, with the promise that come out of that is a better life for a person. And that's what we believe we do on the financial side, and we can partner to do on the medical side.
The past 2 years have really spotlighted mRNA, which I like to say was sort of an overnight success. It took 20 years in the making. Where are some of the exciting areas that we're moving in terms of gene cell therapy? I know, sickle cell anemia has been an incredible breakthrough in terms of treatments for that. What's the next area? Because it seems as though the last couple of years it's been superseded by mRNA and the public health emergency.
So, a couple of points to make. Number one is, and this is really fundamental to what goes on across Mass General Brigham, what goes on across science and the life of the scientist, and what it takes, how long it takes to translate any of that fundamental research into something that ultimately will help people, because that's really what you're talking about. So we talk about mRNA, you talk about a lot of these different things. You just have to sit back and say, but how many years did it take in how many laboratories working through very, very basic mechanisms and understanding of biology, of disease, to get to that point? So what we learned during the pandemic, among many, many, many things, and I'm sure we're going to touch on them in a little bit as well, it's the flexibility, it's the fluidity, it's how quickly one can change and adapt to what's going on. So, you have to think about it in a couple of parts. Number one is, again, and I can't emphasize this enough, we have across Mass General Brigham, and you have across the country, people who are spending their lives in basic fundamental research. I can't emphasize that enough, because people have to understand, it's important for all of us to understand the length of time it often takes to translate that basic science into a place where you see those first-in-human studies, where it then moves across the entire continuum into approval, into product, into patients. How can we do this more quickly? That is really the fundamental challenge, and how can we do it better together? It shouldn't take a pandemic to make these things move as quickly as they did. It's good that we moved as quickly as we did, but without those fundamental years behind us, it wouldn't have happened. And that really speaks to how we need to change the process. When we talk about gene and cell therapy, remember, we're talking about large platforms that have applicability in multiple diseases. So this isn't something where there's a technology and it has one disease. Here's cell-based therapy, there's one disease or there's one area. So we're just seeing this in its infancy. We're seeing this in a number of different genetic disorders where gene therapy will be appropriate, and we'll see what that looks like. And you'll hear some of that over the next 2 days. Cell-based therapy, we think about that a lot in terms of cancer. The fundamental changes in human health and cancer management that this technology has enabled. But again, if we think about where that's going to go, it will impact neurologic diseases, cardiovascular diseases, many, many different diseases. And that is why this is in its infancy. That is why this is exciting. That is why we can all work on that together. And that is why across Mass General Brigham, we are launching this major initiative in gene and cell therapy. Because again, you have to look at what you have. So what we have are hundreds and hundreds of scientists across this healthcare system, all working in this area. How do we leverage that and work with companies? What is it that what's unique that we have? What's unique that companies have? What's unique that investors can bring to this? What we have is this. There are a lot of things, but I would summarize this in this way. It is bringing together the clinicians, it's the researchers, and the researcher may be the same clinician who takes care of you, and the patients. And being able to look at it from that perspective, understand what are the right targets, what are the right first-in-human studies, what are the things that need to be done here, how do we navigate this together with partnerships with industry, with venture, with government, with others, to really move this forward. So the answer is, it's not one disease, it's not one area, but the possibilities here are really enormous. I wouldn't say they're endless, but they seem that way looking at the spectrum of things where this technology and these technologies can really play a role in human health.
You know, as I hear you talking about it, I think about the technology. You know, if I went to my Bank of America account and I were in Fiji, I would probably still be able to go to the ATM, securely get money from my account at an ATM. Probably pay a couple fees, but I'd get it. Now, when my mom, she passed away, but when she broke her arm a few years ago, she went to the ER at Brigham.
Yep.
Then she went to her orthopedist up the hill at Baptist. Less than a mile between those two hospitals, and we couldn't get her scans from Brigham transferred up there, and much less securely. How do you create an infrastructure where you can transfer this information securely better between health systems so that I don't have to be dependent on only being on one health system because they are on Epic, or health systems that are all on Epic because I know I can get that? And also, how do you use this technology to make sure as you're doing your research that it is more equitable and it is more open, and you're not just doing it on the usual suspects that may not include people like me?
Sure. I'm happy to take that. So you bring up a number of really critical issues. The first issue is data, transfer of data. What are we really doing to create a digital infrastructure, even within our own healthcare system? What does that look like? So the case that you gave, this example, getting an X-ray here, what happens to it, where you get your care, that's fundamental to what we're doing. So part of the thinking here is looking at how we best provide the continuum of care. And I love the Bank of America analogy, because in coming together as an integrated academic healthcare system and putting patients at the center of it, the goal is that that patient experience ought to be the same wherever you are in the system. So if I look at Mass General, I look at the Brigham, I look at our 3 specialty hospitals, I look at our community hospitals, one needs to go anywhere or any of the ambulatory sites and get the same level of care. And that is fundamental to 2 things: a digital underpinning, correct data platforms and sharing, and also how do we get the right care in the right place at lower cost, which is really a fundamental thing we're all thinking about. So let me give you an example. One of the things we've done is to put together enterprise-wide systems in radiology, in pathology, in emergency medicine. We're now working on anesthesia. And your point is the exact point to bring up in radiology. So what used to happen is, no matter where you lived, you'd have to, if you needed a very specialized radiology interpretation, you might have to drive to Mass General or the Brigham. In all the years I saw patients at Mass General, people would drive in to get a scan at Mass General simply because there was nobody out there in community hospitals who could read a really complicated scan. With enterprise radiology, it's the same protocols no matter where you go. And because of the digitalization of images, those images can be sent, and that's what we've done now with enterprise radiology, anywhere in the system. So if you go to a community hospital, you can get your films there. If these films need to be read by a subspecialist, those images are digitally routed to the right radiologist. That's amazingly important for patients, for convenience, for best care, for uniformity of care. Transfer between healthcare systems is another area. So again, we're on Epic, that's our main system. But how you put together all of this data, how you prepare for a digital future, how you do things that enable physicians, patients, researchers, educators to get the highly curated data they may need for care, for administration. That's exactly what we're doing now. So bringing in Jane Moran, who's our new, this is the first for us, CIDO in the system. She came to us from Unilever and has already started to completely transform how we look at data, how we look at all of these services, so we can provide that. System to system, place to place, hospital to hospital. That's data transfer, that's compatibility, and all of those things are being worked on. So even right now in Massachusetts, you can get your data transferred securely from one healthcare system to another. But again, what we really need is for people to be on a completely digitalized platform, so that no matter where they go, to another healthcare system, to another state, wherever they are, the data that their providers need will be immediately accessible. And that, of course, is the future that we're all aiming for.
So if you think about the history of this hospital system, and they were localized in the community, people went to them for access. That same thing happened in banking 30, 40, 50 years ago before interstate banking became in. It's now you see national platforms, and then there's a bump in the road as you start to get these things knitted together, and then there's a need to get the information. But I think all these are going to be drilled off of a commonality of data, an understanding the data has to be clean, the understanding data has to be accessible, the understanding data has to be analyzable for different purposes at different times, and be irrefutable if you're going to base healthcare decisions on it, that you can't have it. But to your point, the reach of healthcare then changes dramatically. And so we've worked with people to give glasses to kids. Well, give a glasses to kids is not the most difficult procedure, but if there's something else behind that that's causing that then becomes, but you can have a doc look at the results of those tests. They don't have to be in the Charlotte at that particular time, maybe anywhere they want. So the ability to move the information to the specialists who see hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of cases and that interests us as an employer, because when you think about our employees all over the world, we're sitting there saying, how can they get the best health care for the best outcome? And then we'll worry about the cost, because even though it's a big cost for us, as a percentage of the cost we have to employ all the people, it's a small percentage. And so better outcomes are more important for us. They think it's a competitive benefit for work. So again, we have this idea of how can we actually utilize all these wonderful people like Mass General for the benefit of our whole entire employee base. And so there's kind of interesting ways employers are pushing this. So this idea of platform, starting from mapping DNA way back on the medical side, and the ideas of platform on digital, and the ideas of movement, and the ideas of think about mental health, which is a huge issue. The ability to get provider reach is so different, and it won't be useful for every, an emergency case at night when someone's done something horrible to themselves or something. That's different than the regular therapy session stuff. So thinking about all that there's a lot of places to go with this stuff.
How do you balance that? You're both large employers. Between you employ more than 250,000 people. I wonder how you balance, the excitement of therapies and developing these therapies, which often come, and because of the long time frame, end up with really large price tickets, right, at the end of the day. And yet, as large employers with lots of lives that you need to take care of, you have to worry about the cost, and you want there to be accessibility. So Brian, I wonder about it, particularly as a banker. On the one hand, you want to push these companies, right? And it's great if they do really well, but on the other hand, on the other side, you're going to have to write a check. Right. How do you balance that?
It's all, for us to drive the cost curve down, it's all about wellness. At the end of the day, diabetes and related diseases, weight, and other just basic wellness will change the curve of that. We will not be able to solve the cancer piece. Hopefully my colleague here will solve it, make it more accessible, because that's not something that we can control. We can control the health determinants that we can control, and so we put a lot on that to bend that curve over time. And then, so what you do inside a reimbursement thought process, a pay thought process, is drive the cost down. So a teammate at our company gets family coverage for their family for about $250 a month, and it costs us $2,000 a month, to give you a sense. And so we've kept that cost flat for lower paid teammates for 12 years now, never raised it. What we've then done is trade things for more, fill the biometric screening on. What does that do? That identifies people early in stages that need help. And so we're trying to figure out ways that we can increase the good outcomes, and then ultimately we have, because we're a large employer, relationships with places like Mass General, where we can, when those very difficult cases, we can find the trials and things like that to help, because and sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't, because the person where they are in their status, but that's something we also try to do. So I think it's largely about, these companies are just always going to be lowering the real cost of this. whether the price point on a particular element drug is different, but they're lowering the real cost for it because of efficiency and effectiveness. These technologies give you great things, and our job is to support that development as society and as a company and as an investment bank and stuff. But our real job is also to create an atmosphere where people understand that trade-off is very good for America, ultimately, in terms of, when I go around the world, people want to come here to get treated at Mass General.
Well, it also brings up the point of, we started, when we're talking about this, it's really the right care, right place, right time, thinking about cost and how the hospital-centric model is really changing so dramatically. And to the point about having impact, I mean, what we learned again during the pandemic was that what we wanted to do was to deliver the best care, but we were talking about delivering it in a lot of different places. But again, with virtual care, we're entering a completely new universe. So, Zoom visits, which is just kind of the tip of the iceberg, it was a couple of thousand before the pandemic. And we got to about 2 million visits during the height of it. So this is how far we went. If you think specifically about behavioral health, so a number of visits that were quote unquote Zoom only have now become mixed. Some are Zoom, some are in person, virtual, but probably still close to 90% of behavioral health visits are virtual. So we always need to think about how do we take the expertise of those highest level, it's really the care of the tertiary quaternary disorders that used to only be delivered near us, with us, and how do we get that expertise out regionally, nationally, and digital is a very important way to do that. And then, Brian, to your point about behavioral health, yes, there are always those patients who are going to come to the emergency departments with really in crisis, who will need to be hospitalized. But if we think about it, if we use virtual care in a smart way, and we think about how we introduce that care early on to people, the goal is to prevent those hospitalizations as best one can. The best is how you make connections to people so you can actually, again, prevent a lot of the emergencies and post-emergency or post-hospitalization. Follow people in a way that makes sense to them so that you don't have this vicious cycle of constantly coming into the hospital in crisis. It applies to behavioral health. It applies to chronic disease management. It applies to a lot of different things. And when we talk about virtual health, again, we're only at the infancy. So technology-enabled virtual care, which is where we are going to, will really enable us to do a lot of things in the home that before we could only do in an office.
Which is a wonderful thing when you're talking about the Medicare population. So I have a question, it's one that I think about a lot, especially if we talk about breakthrough therapies. We haven't had very good luck with therapies like Aduhelm, really very mixed results. But the holy grail, I think, for boomers like me, is that we will come up with a therapy that really is good for Alzheimer's and neurological degeneration. And I remember talking about this with former Secretary Alex Azar. I said, if you actually got a drug like a Sovaldi that actually could cure you, that drug is worth $1 million. Because just think about all the lives that are impacted by that. But as a society, we can't be paying $1 million for every single person who would benefit from this drug. We just can't afford it. And one of the things that he said was, maybe we come up with a different way to pay for it over time rather than having to pay for it all at once. Because we are talking about a lifetime drug. I'm wondering if you guys have thought about this when we are in the high-class problem of having this drug that's taken a long time to develop, but is likely going to be astronomically priced. What's the way to make this something that we can make accessible and equitable and that doesn't bankrupt our country?
So pharmaceutical costs are an enormous issue in terms of costs. That applies to a huge number of drugs across the board and certainly does drive up healthcare costs. Fundamentally, what we're talking about here is we're talking about not diseases of a few or a few 100,000. It's not rare diseases. They're incredibly common diseases. And how do we approach this in terms of a number of different things? And it's a very, obviously complicated question, but you've got chronic disease management, so that's sort of one set of things. When do you intervene? Can you start a therapy early enough so that you actually prevent a disease? Can you cure a disease very early on? At what point do you do any intervention? So the kind of challenges that this conversation and that your really excellent question raises is, how do we think about this in a very, very different way? So we don't have an answer yet, but I would say that fundamentally, when you get to a point where you have a cure for a disease, that's a very, very different discussion than how do you make incremental changes in a chronic disease. And the pricing issues are also very problematic, as we all know. And it's, I think, really thinking about what is the size of the market? What does that really look like? How do you price things writ large? Who pays for it? What's the role of the government? What's the role of the insurers? What's the role of all of us? So I don't have an answer. It's an incredibly important question. I do hope we get to the point in that disease where we can start to ask those questions. We're not there yet, though.
But it's also there are drugs that were prohibitively expensive a generation ago that get driven down by the subsequent innovation. And now this is a very specified thing we're at the start of, but think about the things we're at a different place. And so I think people have to forget, it's always viewed as a exact trade-off for this drug at this cost for this treatment. And it's an infrastructure which we could change that, so we have high healthcare costs as a percentage of GDP. That when I travel around the world, everybody tells me that. But again, the treatment continuum is so different that you don't have to wait for a knee replacement, things like that. All that kind of stuff you don't have to do is you have these drugs available to you. So I think it has to be answered in a holistic way. But the real question is, how do we use everything we talked about before to drive the cost down, to drive the preventable things up, early on, and that will keep saving money. And then if we get to invest it, for those of us who had a loved one have that disease, if you could stop it, you would pay for it. But one of the ways you pay for it is by making everything else 5%, 10%, 15% more efficient, and help set up the thing. But the debate, a treatment cost versus a thing, at the end point, I think misses all the variants and stuff that come up.
Well, but I mean, we've seen the prices come down for things like HIV, and I'm happy that I have friends who 30 years ago I didn't think I'd see live to a ripe old age, and with some cancers we've seen that, and some of that has been more accessible because over time it's gone generic.
Yes.
But when you get a new drug, it's a different
I'll take
story.
up my colleagues, but you got to pay for all the research. I mean, you got to pay for how it got here, and that's what people forget. So they only see this. That's what I'm saying. They see this end of it, but they're missing the 45,000 times people failed, and they're missing the years and years of development. They're missing somebody who's 15 years into their research career, and it didn't quite break the right way. And so all that's going on, and I think the private market's pretty good about sorting this out. So today's generic was somebody's moonshot.
That's right.
A generation ago, and that's what. So and then you get to us, right? All maintenance drugs are free under our plan now.
Well, remember also
we can't do that. We couldn't do that unless the technology drove it down.
Right,
but
exactly.
But the value of it for our teammates to give it to for free is exponential. But it wouldn't have been here had somebody not spent the money 25, 30 years ago or 40 years ago.
And we started by talking about the length of time it takes for a lot of this research, when you first asked that first question, how long it takes for a lot of this research to actually come to that point. And that's exactly what you're talking about. But we are now also entering some very interesting times in terms of drug discovery. How do we look at drug discovery in a different way? How do AI-enabled technologies enable us to look at things very differently? How do we target different diseases very early on? How do we look at use of old drugs in a very different way? So again, if you can put some of that cost that you've talked about, that we acknowledge, and look at that in a different way too, and shorten that cycle, that ultimately may affect those drug costs as well.
Well, we are running out of time and didn't get any questions from the audience. So I want to thank you for what has been a wonderful discussion, and thank you so much for having me. It's a great forum, and certainly look forward to hearing all of the things that develop here.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.